It's always interesting, and it's a great privilege to be able to do it. I do want to, you've probably all seen this message, but I do want to alert people to the fact that we are recording this event, just so that nobody's taken aback by that. I don't think you show up in it. I think really it's the speakers who show up in the recording, but just so you know that that's happening. And so just to be, I don't want to burn up too much time, but to say that it's a particular pleasure of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations to host the Dumanian Visiting Scholar and the Dumanian Lecture Series. We're looking forward to a tremendous program tonight that has been organized by our Dumanian visiting professor, Silvia Alajaji. We want to, once again, as ever, thank our benefactor, Mrs. Dumanian, for her ongoing support of this wonderful visiting professorship and series of lectures. And and I also want to state some logistical issues, which are that we will wait and hold questions. There are going to be 4 speakers tonight, or 3 speakers and a moderator. We're going to hold all questions until the end of the presentations. Questions should be submitted via the chat, and then we'll read them out and the panelists can respond to them. And in the meantime, please keep your microphones muted, because that really helps the sound quality of the event. And having said that, it's my pleasure to hand this event over to my colleague, Professor Herak Bhartanyan.
Thank you, Holly. I was finding the unmute button. So let me introduce today's presenters. And of course, I will start with Professor Silvia Alajaji, who will be the moderator in today's event. So Professor Silvia Angelique Alajaji is an associate professor of music at Franklin and Marshall College, where she also teaches in the International Studies program. She's the author of Music and the Armenian Diaspora, Searching for Home in Exile, a multi-sided work that examines the construction of diasporic Armenian subjectivity in the years since the Armenian Genocide, which was recently published in Turkish translation. Her published work centers on the relationship between music and exilic identity, focusing primarily on Armenian diasporic communities in Lebanon and the United States. She's currently in residence at the University of Chicago as a Dumanian visiting professor in Armenian studies. So then our today's participants. So first is Mashinka Firunz Hakopian, who is a writer, artist, and researcher born in Yerevan and residing in Glendale, California. Her work is concentrated in media studies, visual culture, contemporary art, and West Asian diaspora studies. She holds a PhD in the history of art from the University of Pennsylvania. Her book, Algorithmic Bias Training, Lectures for Intelligent Machines, is forthcoming in 2021 from X Artists Books. She is currently an associate director of research at the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles and an associate editor for Noima magazine. Prior to joining the institute, she held a 2-year teaching appointment in the UCLA's Department of English, where she designed courses in media studies, critical race studies, feminist and queer theory, and visual culture. Her writing and reviews have appeared in various magazines and journals. Her performances and projects have been presented at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, Museum of Contemporary Art in LA, Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, Drawing Center in New York, Judson Memorial Church in New York, and in the New Museum, New York, Voice Register Series. Her individual and collaborative work has received coverage in Arts in America, Hyperallergic, Aspares, the New York Times, and Armenian Public Radio. Our next participant is Kemi Abrahamian, who is a supreme hyphenate who arrives in the world today as an interdisciplinary writer, artist, producer, performer, organizer, and a non-binary queer feminist caregiver. They grew up in an immigrant suburb of Toronto and was born into an Armenian family displaced from the Southwest Asia, North Africa region. Kemi's work is steeped with relational and generative practices oriented towards ancestral reclamation, visionary fiction, and diasporic futurism. They hold a BFA, BA in Film and Political Science from Concordia University, an MA in Expressive Art Therapy from the European Graduate Institute, and is pursuing a PhD in Community, Liberation, Indigenous, and Eco-Psychologies from Pacifica Graduate Institute. Kemi has published plays, literary and academic writing, while organizing and presenting films, artwork, stage performances, and workshops internationally. Recent projects include the highly lauded and widely screened works Ensouled, Hoktanil, Transmission, and Dear Armen. They currently work both freelance and collaboratively with various collectives and ad hoc groups, and they are the Arts and Creative Expression Tactic Lead at the Global Feminist Movement Support Organization, the Association for Women's Rights in Development. Next, Herak Bhartanyan, who is the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Hyperallergic, is an art critic, curator, artist, and lecturer on contemporary art with an expertise on the intersection of art and politics. Breaking news, award-winning reporting, informed opinions, and quality conversations about art have helped Hyperallergic reach an audience of over 1 million people a month. Some of his notable essays include Imagining the Future Before Us, his keynote at the American Craft Council's 2019 National Conference, and his criticism of Tribute in Light. He started podcasting regularly in 2016 and in 2018 launched the Hyperallergic podcast. In 2017, his Fixed Point Perspective project serves as a debut exhibition at Minerva Projects in Denver, Colorado. Featuring the work of Garine Torosyan and Herak Sarkisian, among others, the 10-year project examines the legacy of Ottoman studio photography in contemporary art and visual culture. In April 2018, he created a collaborative installation with artist Sharon Loudon at the Mary Sharp and Valenta Studio program in Brooklyn, New York. Titled Origins, it explored the 5-year professional and personal friendship between the pair as a starting point for a bigger conversation about beginnings and ends. So without further ado, I am giving the floor to our today's participants. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Holly and to Lipsime for the wonderful introductions. And I will just echo Holly's thanking of the Dumanians who have made this fellowship and this position possible and the event that we're going to be having today. I also just want to say how incredibly honored I am that Herak, Kemi, and Mashinka have agreed to take part in this. This is sort of a labor of love and joy for me, and also one very selfish because I wanted nothing more than to get the 3 of them in a room together. And so I'm so grateful to them for indulging me this. So the way it's going to go to this evening, I'll give very brief remarks, just sort of setting the stage for why we're all here. And then Mashinka is going to speak for a bit, and then Kemi, and then Herak will close everything off. And then we're going to do Q&A. So please, as we've mentioned, please feel free to chat your questions to us. For security reasons, we're going to just have the questions by chat. Okay, so admittedly, I first began thinking about Armenian futures in a moment of darkness. It was late summer 2020, on the heels of the devastating explosion in Beirut, where my family is from, and at the height of the Artsakh war. We were surrounded, we as Armenians were surrounded by a nauseating deja vu. This was so familiar, it was too familiar. It was a present that seemed to be the natural outgrowth of a past steeped in tragedy and loss. And so, as it has before, my work became a sort of a salve. I retreated into music. That music that had brought joy to those who had come before, to those who had faced so much worse. I looked at pictures taken at kebabs and at the barahantesses and listened to recordings that seemed to exist in a different dimension. And I sang to my daughter, my 3-year-old. I sang to her in the dark. I sang to her a lullaby that my mother had sung to me. A lullaby her mother, my grandmother, had sung to her. A lullaby that her mother, my grandmother, probably learned at the orphanage in Beirut where Armenian life had begun anew. In these pasts of beauty, of intimacy, of joy, imagine what futures they might hold, what futures of beauty and wonder and of possibility. The possibilities these pasts hold for world making, for liberation, for broader solidarities, and for the reclaiming of queer, feminist, and otherwise marginalized Armenian narratives. And as I began to look around me, I realized I'm not the only one thinking about this. So many of us cling to this joy, this beauty, this intimacy that has sustained us for so many centuries. And I'm looking at the participants, and so many of the people who have been sort of a guiding light for me as scholars and as sort of visible Armenian figures are the ones that I credit for allowing me to sort of think about these questions as I work through not just what it means to be Armenian on an intellectual level, but what it means to be Armenian on a personal level as well. I see Arlene Abakyan, whose memoir and whose work has been so profoundly important in shaping the way we are able to imagine ourselves. David Kazanjian, Hegnar Wattenpa, these amazing scholars who have just allowed us to think in unexpected and beautiful ways about what it means to be Armenian. Also, I would like to thank the Critical Armenian Studies Collective, the members of this just incredibly bright and incredibly just intellectual forces who are also thinking about very similar things such as this. And also the Armenian American Action Network, who is mobilizing and giving people and newer generations a way to think about being Armenian in very, very new and profound ways. So I hope you are all here with me ready to think about what these Armenian futures look like, and also understand that a lot of what we're talking about is happening in conversation with, of course, Afrofuturism, which has been so incredibly influential, Arab futurism, which has also been very, very influential, and also futures of indigeneity and other sorts of marginalized pasts that have become such a guiding force for Armenians today. So with that, I will hand it over to Mashinta, and then I look forward to hearing everybody and to your questions at the end.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Sylvia, and for bringing this space into being. And thank you to Holly and Hipsime and the faculty at UChicago for making this possible. I want to open with an acknowledgement that I am delivering this talk from Utah, from the ancestral unceded homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute peoples. And I want to begin around a kitchen table with a tableau that will be familiar to many of you, related to tasseography, the method of divination that reads the future in the patterns of coffee grounds. In Armenian, bajak naye. A historically feminized practice, it's been matrilineally transmitted for centuries, enacted in private domestic spaces intended for kin and intimate coteries. It's among the more informal practices of divination in the diaspora. And those of us who have had hot candle wax poured into our hair in the interest of learning our future will understand what I mean. Tasseography is the subject of an eponymous series by Ali Cat-Leeds, a Portland-based artist of Armenian descent who produces work under the name Entangled Roots Press. In lieu of predictions about marital trajectories and wealth accumulation, the tasseomancer in this series foresees futures marked by decolonization, justice for our communities, and queer liberation. Leeds writes that tasseography is a practice that has been passed down through the women on my Armenian side of the family and was taught to me by my mother, she from her mother, and so on. Sociology scholar Karina Karapetyan-Georgi describes this as a form of domestic intelligence or subversive knowledge production. Georgi frames tasseography as Armenian matrilineal rituals and underreported cultural practices that Armenian women use to access distinct forms of intuition-based knowledge that open up an array of possibilities by disorienting time and space. Tasseography unsettles time. It occupies multiple temporalities. It constitutes a practice that can be traced to the historical past that's enacted in the present in order to divine a desired future. In my family, my mother's sister Anahit was the resident doyen of Bajak Nael. She was believed to be a powerful medium who boasted that she had contacted the ghost of Alexander Pushkin, whose behavior she described as roguish. Recalling the matrilineal practices of tasseography in her own family, Leeds writes that she watched her grandmother read coffee grounds and would notice how oftentimes her grandmother would see what she would want to say. Like most predictive technologies, coffee reading may not divine outcomes programmed in advance so much as it deliberately codes a desired future. That is to say, it represents a form of speculative world making, a method for conjuring the futures the reader may want to see. Leeds' tasseography series was included in a digital exhibition I co-curated last month with Anahit Oshagan and Ara Oshagan at Reflect Space Gallery in Glendale. Entitled Sites of Fracture, Diasporic Imaginings of Occupied Artsakh, the exhibition was staged in a 360-degree photographic reconstruction of occupied Shushi. It gestured toward the repatriation of ancestral lands, envisioning decolonial futures for the region, and visualizing an Artsakh where Indigenous communities exercise the right to self-governance and cultural autonomy. As Leeds puts it, we see what we want to say. I'm invoking coffee reading and Leeds' series here as exemplary of Armeno-futurist practices. Each looks back toward earlier histories in order to look forward toward speculative futures. As scholars like Sevan Bukian have argued, diasporic identities in their fragmentation and dispersal are shaped by decentralized forms of meaning-making that emerges in community structures and has the capacity to decenter the nation state as the primary site of meaning and belonging. The fragmentary, nonlinear time of diasporas is radically incommensurate with the time of the nation state. Diasporic practices of collective memory work look forward by looking back. And the practices I'm most interested in, which I'll discuss in a minute, often look back across several centuries toward Indigenous Armenian culture making, not as a means of making ethno-territorial claims, but in order to resist forces of historical erasure and occupation. Affirming Armenian indigeneity in West Asia has taken on renewed urgency in the last year amidst the military campaign of ethnic cleansing that Sylvia's remarks alluded to, launched by Azerbaijan in Artsakh. Despite an extensive historical record that attests otherwise, state actors justified continuous bombardment and the displacement of 100,000 Artsakhtsis with the counterfactual claim that there had never been a historical Armenian presence in the region. After seizing and occupying ancestral Armenian lands, Azerbaijan continues to invoke this claim in order to legitimize a policy of erasure and proceed with the widely documented destruction of Armenian monuments and cultural heritage, documented here by the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. Confronted by settler futurities that aim to eradicate Indigenous life and life worlds, diasporan artists have responded to being defutured by developing resistant practices that surface Indigenous West Asian pasts as a means to sketch liberatory Armeno-futurisms. And here is Kami's work, Recognize Artsakh, which has appeared all over the world and which I believe they'll be discussing in their talk, so I won't go too far into it. But to reiterate, in their multi-locality and multi-temporality, diasporic futurist practices resist the constraints of straight linear time and the chrononormativity that undergirds the nation state. Queer studies scholar Elizabeth Freeman describes chrononormativity as the use of time to organize individual human bodies toward maximum productivity, particularly to serve the economic and reproductive interests of the nation state. Chrononormativity is the time enforced by schedules, calendars, time zones, and most recently, Apple Watches. It's what undergirds wage work and enables the management of populations. The standardized timeline of birth, education, marriage, property ownership, reproduction, and death. As Freeman puts it, in the eyes of the state, this sequence of socioeconomically productive moments is what it means to have a life at all. These milestones all are predicated on moving forward along a linear trajectory. So looking backward to craft a future from the raw matter of the past is a departure from chrononormativity. It represents a threat to the coherence of the nation state as a hetero-reproductive unit and to the nation state's techno-scientific narratives of progress. Diasporic experience is marked by dislocations and displacements in time and space, by practices of memory work that resist erasure through collective remembrance. And in that way, diasporic experience and culture making are antithetical to chrononormativity. They inhabit the register of queer time, or what Jose Munoz has famously described as queer futurity, regarding the past as a field of possibility in which subjects can act in the present in the service of a new futurity. Queer futurity recognizes that the present is not enough, is insufficient, is toxic to queer, diasporic, and racialized bodies, and that the conjuring of alternate futures is a mechanism of survival. And here I want to note, of course, that neither Freeman nor Munoz are explicitly referencing West Asian or West Asian diasporic context. So of course, their formulations can't be mapped wholesale onto Armenian diasporic practices. And I also want to point to the fact that I'm framing Armeno-Futurism in relation to queer time in dialogue with an extensive field of work in this space by scholars like Nelly Sarkisian, Karina Karapetyan-Georgi, David Kazanjian, who's here, and the crucial issue of Armenian Review on Queering Armenian Studies that was edited by Georgi and Tamar Shirinian, which is where some of the articles listed here appear, as well as venues like Hyphen, Hyperallergic, and the Critical Armenian Studies Collective. And of course, this is only a partial list of interlocutors for this work. I also want to note, as Sylvia did, that the techniques, tactics, and tropes of Armeno-Futurism owe a great debt to the aesthetics of Afrofuturism, Indigenous Futurism, and Arab Futurism, among others, each of which, of course, it goes without saying, has its own distinctive visual vocabulary, which I will refrain from discussing at length now in the interest of time, but on screen is a still from Space Exodus, a film by Palestinian artist Larissa Sansor, which imagines Palestinian astrofutures. And for some amazing writing on the topic, I highly recommend the work of Karim Estefan, who's also here with us today. So I want to step back for a moment here. Up to this point, I've argued for Armeno-Futurism in the diasporic context as a set of practices that can be characterized as queer, incompatible with the logic of the nation state, and decolonial. Decolonial insofar as they invoke West Asian indigenous pasts to envision futures where self-determination is possible. In the time that remains, I'll turn to the question, what is the tense in which Armenian diasporic culture making unfolds? And I want to approach that question askance by looking at a recent exhibition staged in Glendale, which some of you may already be familiar with. The exhibition, initially titled Vision Valley, the Glendale Biennial, was held in 2018 against the backdrop of rapid, inequitable economic development in the city. It was convened at a municipal space, Glendale Brand Library and Art Center. The organizers who direct the Pitt Gallery in Glendale described the exhibition as a celebration of artists working in a specific community. As many of you will know, Glendale's population is roughly 40% Armenian. Despite that fact, no Armenian artists were included in the roster of the biennial's 32 predominantly white contributors. When they were asked about why Armenian artists were omitted from the exhibition, the curators responded that the criteria were simple. Any contemporary fine artist who lives, works, or maintains a studio in Glendale would be considered. The exhibition showcases some of the many contemporary artists who live or work in Glendale and whose work is part of a conversation around contemporary art. Contemporary appears 4 times in this paragraph, and its appearances suggest to me a temporal incompatibility between the present moment and the cultural activities of Armenian diasporans. It's difficult not to read its ubiquity as an injunction that no duduk players, khachkar carvers, or provincials need apply. This insistence on the contemporary resurfaces Edward Said's post-colonial commonplace, the Orientalized other imagined as a figure whose cultural products are frozen in amber, outside of time, suspended in the tense of what Said famously calls the timeless eternal. Notably, some of the 32 artists in the exhibition neither lived nor worked in Glendale. Edward Weston, who was included in the biennial, neither lived nor worked in Glendale at the time because he's been deceased since 1958. Despite being dead for 60 odd years, Weston was deemed more legible as a contemporary Glendalian artist than any Armenian artist living in the city in 2018. So I point to this exhibition as an example of the anxieties around the time and tense of Armenian diasporic culture making, as an example of the perception that by looking backward, by engaging in practices of collective memory work, diasporan practitioners obstruct the forward movement of linear time and cultural progress as sketched in a dominant frame and exclude themselves from eligibility in the contemporary as a category. And in that way, Armenian diasporan artists act as agents of what Freeman calls temporal drag. And this is a play on drag's multiple meanings, a form of community-based queer performance and the act of pulling against a counterforce, specifically the pull of the past on the present as a productive obstacle to progress. I'm invoking the performance of temporal drag as a crucial dimension of Armeno-Futurism, which places a necessary pressure on the present tense. I want to conclude with the work of Armenian Futurism that exerts this pull on the present. Dalia El-Sayed and Andrew Demirchian's Which Yesterday is Tomorrow, an installation that generates an alternate world situated in a timeline which is not our own, or at least is not yet our own. It harkens back to Swana histories of cohabitation and cultural co-creation, drawing influence from narratives like those of Ashraf Passendi, born Martiros Kompetyan, an Ottoman Armenian in Sivas who gained acclaim across coffee houses in the region as a Kemani playing minstrel before he had to flee during the Hamidian massacres of 1890s. Conjuring the West Asian coffee house of centuries past, El-Sayed and Demirchian craft a space in the present that might serve as a blueprint for radical socialities in the future. For the project, they invited a group of Swana designers, painters, and sculptors to contribute to the space, aiming through this collaboration to unsettle prevailing media narratives of perpetual war and ethno-territorial conflict in the region. The artists call the installation a rest stop for the future based on the past, calling up a Muniozian model of queer time where the past is a field of possibility leading into a new futurity. I want to end here on an image of Armeno-Futurism that organizes a space for Swana sociality and kinship, an Armeno-Futurism grounded in coalition building and cohabitation that exerts the pressure of temporal drag on the present, that foresees decolonization and self-determination, and visualizes liberation in the aesthetic vocabulary of a future that is still en route to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mashinka, for starting us off with such an utterly brilliant and profound framing. And it sets the stage perfectly for our next speaker, Kemi Abrahamian. So Kemi, you take it from here.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. So give me a second. Okay, so before we start, I would like to acknowledge that I am an uninvited guest living on the stolen Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee territory, living adjacent to the Mohawk community of Tyendinaga. I'm a visitor here. My name is Kemi. This is me pouring water out of a gouge on set for a film that I co-wrote, co-produced, and performed in with a bunch of really amazing Armenian, queer, and/or women creatives, while being severely sleep deprived and nursing my young my young child between takes. This is maybe the most truest slide that you will see here. So, sorry, there we go. So I wanted to start off by saying thank you so much for having me. It is a massive honor to be sharing space with everyone here, and especially Mashinka and Herak. I feel a little bit imposter syndrome-y, but I'm gonna let it go. I also feel, I'm just starting with feelings. I also feel it is a really interesting moment. I was saying this earlier, to be contemplating the future of our people in this current time, in this current day. But I'll try to stay on track and talk about how my work feels important here in this space. So I wanted to start off by talking about Dear Armen really quickly, because it really sets the stage, I think, for my work in an important way. So it was an idea that evolved out of a collaboration through an arts company called Collage Arts that I founded with my creative partner, Lee Williams Bodakian. It was a project that was originally born as an immersive theater experience, and then it eventually evolved into an interactive performance installation. It was a zine, it was a short film, it became a workshop at some point. So I'm going to show the trailer, but essentially Dear Armen is a story that is inspired by Armen Ohanian, who I'm not sure if folks know about her. Look her up. I am by no means an expert, even though I did dedicate like years of my life to figuring her out and trying to tell her story. But essentially, Dear Armen weaves together the voices and struggles of 3 generations of women and gender nonconforming Armenians. And I'll say a little bit more about it shortly. As soon as this works.
I have been researching Armen Ohanian for some months now. I'm a researcher and writer interested especially in reviving the stories of women who are not often or not at all represented in literature or history books. I am interested in particular in writing about my ancestors, about the people that came before me who do not have many documents or whose documents have been lost because of displacement, deportation, migration, and genocide. I am interested in how I can write into silence. Armen left trails to follow, even if those trails don't always lead to the truth. And somehow, in finding some of Armen, I am finding something of myself. Like following pieces of red thread, I glimpse at tiny parts of her life and follow the threads to see where they lead. So far, I have found only a little. There's Sophia the daughter, Sophia the survivor of the Armenian pogroms, Armenuhi the dancer, Armen the determined artist. How many people were you, Armen? How many masks did you have to wear? As she wrote in her memoirs, I must present myself under this mask. The most striking of all were my eyes. They were those of an enraged tigress. The whole kingdom talked of me. 1,000 stories were invented about me to thrill the bazaars and the baths. No one doubted that I had become a traitor to my religion. It was not true. I was and I remain, in spite of everything, a good Christian who believes in God and paradise. But my piety, different from that of others, was in my own soul. The Christian world called me a heretic and a courtesan, and these terrible epithets were crowned with the name daughter of Sodom and Gomorrah. Your feet are set upon a downward path, my daughter, he sighed. You will soon be changed from an honest woman to an artist. Your fall is inevitable. You are young, you are alone, you dance. One sees your face, your naked feet. Corruption awaits you. I see it.
that link doesn't work anymore, so nobody go to deararmen.com, just FYI. So this was a really big project of mine that gave me, for the first time, I think, in my life, an outlet or a platform or a way to make art and write about Armenianness and queerness and diaspora and culture and how to bring everything from the past into the present or future in a way that really centers healing and thriving and justice and love and all that juicy stuff. So my world really cracked open after Dear Armen in a really big way. And it is one of the main reasons why I'm even working as an artist, performer, filmmaker, storyteller today. And it led to my current sort of big project that's definitely relevant to what we're talking about today, which is World of Q. So it's a multidisciplinary project that mostly is multimedia and on a bunch of different levels, and it includes film and digital media and virtual storytelling experiences. And essentially it's a larger story world that features distinct iterations that revolve around the central story world, which is where hackers and healers and cultural workers have formed an underground movement to resist totalitarian erasure of ancestral practices and memory in like a not so distant future. And, you know, Lee and I originally conceived of World of Q because at the time, so this was, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, we were like, why isn't there any Swana sci-fi or Armenian sci-fi or even like any type of visionary fiction or fantasy or anything in those genres? And why do we only get to see our people as like, you know, little blips in films and in books that are largely not written by us and very rarely feature us in ways that reflect like who we really are? And we were just like at a loss. We couldn't think of any examples of that. And so we thought, why don't we just do it? And so we created World of Q. And now I will just say I can give a few different examples of people's work that I consider, you know, or I understand as, you know, Armenian or Swana sci-fi or spec fiction or futurism. Namely, I would say Lee's work, a lot of Lee's work it continues to be that. And Levon also, who might be on this call, Levon Kafavian, who's also a weaver, and Ali's work as well, which is funny. Ali is my child's godmother, which is very cool. So I was very pleased to see their work here. So the first project that we really created for World of Q was a short film called Transmission. It premiered at Flare, which is the BFI Queer Film Festival. We made the film, sorry, I'm just trying to get to the next. We made the film with a crew entirely made up of women, people of color, gender nonconforming, and trans folks. And the core creative team was all Armenian. There was 4 of us: Lee Williams Badakian, Emily Mukotichian, and Anahid Yahjian. And so essentially in the process of the film, we were trying to sort of like experiment with alternate versions of top-down director-centered filmmaking. That was kind of like the goal. Whether we accomplished that or not is like, you know, question mark, but we really tried. And the story follows a queer couple and their cultural conservationists who are working in a not so distant future to preserve the artifacts and histories that are being systematically destroyed by, you know, the current government at the time. So they're in a deadly car accident, time splinters into parallel realities. It separates them, and then each enters their own reality where one dies and the other lives. And then they embark on a search between worlds to find each other again. So I'm just gonna show the trailer really quick. You can also watch the full film online. I can share the link later, but this is just the trailer. Oops.
I'm sorry, we're not seeing the image.
Are you not seeing the video?
No.
Yeah, we can't see it, Kemi.
Okay. I don't know what to do. Can you see my screen? Like, are you seeing that I'm sharing my screen?
I think you should be stopping sharing first, maybe this one, and then going and sharing the other. Because right now, yeah, you are back, your face, but before we had the former screen. So now you have to share it again.
There we go.
Can you see the gold?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Now
Just give me a thumbs
it.
up if you can hear it. Okay. We're good? Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, sorry. I have rural internet, folks. I'm really sorry. Give me 1 second.
Defeat is not an option in the face of any fascist governance. The death only will not knock down the knowledge that leads the fight for freedom.
Great. So as you can see, there's a theme emerging here in my work, super inspired by visionary fiction, but also we were trying to, create this like largely non-existent genre, drawing from our own cultures and histories and resistant movements, specifically in and from the Swana region and our own Armenian backgrounds, and bringing them into a future, showing them living and thriving in the future. One of the main things that I really want to do with World of Q and all the stories that we're telling is to show us thriving in the future, but also just like saving our own selves. Like no thanks to Matt Damon, like please stop sending Matt Damon into space. Like I'm just done with that, so yeah, and hoping to see more of that for sure. So, and just before I even started to write Transmission, actually, I had a baby, and which was another project, and in this time of new parenthood, I conceived of another project in the same story world called Ensouled, which is currently, again, multimedia or interdisciplinary and very iterative also. It's an intergenerational narrative that weaves magical realism and spec fiction with, again, histories of resistance movements and Swana culture. And it largely foregrounds, the survival of communities that are most often underrepresented in mainstream media, and who have survived since time immemorial. This story essentially is in the same story world as World of Q, as I explained earlier. And at this point, nearly an entire generation of resistors and elders and keepers of ancestral knowledge have been wiped out. So the story itself follows this solitary botanist and coder whose name is Badas Khan, was the name of one of my ancestors actually. And they translate frequencies from plant life that are growing in their greenhouse and lab. As pressure mounts to join an ongoing underground resistance movement, Badas Khan buries further into their work, and they become obsessed with recording and decoding unusual frequencies from a newly sprouted plant in their greenhouse. And eventually these frequencies reveal themselves to be secret correspondences between Badas Khan's ancestors, who were a group of resistors and practitioners of magic who survived on their own terms in Ottoman Turkey at the turn of the 20th century. So this character, Badas Khan, has a pretty complicated relationship with their family history and Armenian ancestry, and they have, all this trauma, as we all do, and now they're, being forced to contend with a resurfacing of really painful childhood memories. And we've throughout this narrative, we see these glimpses of like a simulated dimension in which a mysterious narrator, discovers their own existence while transcribing chronicles of the lives of Badas Khan's ancestors. So Ensouled currently takes shape through an illustrated book that I'm still working on in collaboration with an artist, Herak Bhartanyan, whose work you see here. I'm hoping it'll also become an immersive installation, and it's also a multi-phase film project. And it currently exists. You can see part of the story world online as a digital media platform. You just go to ensouled.world. I'm not sure how we're doing on time. Can somebody give me a time check? We're good. Okay. So these are a couple of examples of my visual art. I do like mixed media collage. I've been doing it for maybe 15 years now. I started doing it after my grandmother passed away. I found a box of old photographs under her bed. And then I just started scanning them and like making weird art with them. And then eventually it turned into my primary form of visual art making. On the right is my grandfather, Hagop. In the background, you see Harpert, and he was a tailor. So, I'm showing him doing his thing. And then on the left-hand side is an archival image of 5 young Armenian women who are protesting. I think it was taken in 17 or 18. And while protesting, they were trying to draw attention to the genocide and on the streets of New York. And that is, botanical illustrations of pomegranate seeds and flowers. So this, I'm showing this visual work because it's kind of connected in a lot of ways to my PhD dissertation, which Mashinka is supporting me with so graciously, as on my committee. And the research essentially looks to illuminate relational ontologies and ethics of care from the experiences of women and queer artists and writers from the Swana diaspora who are living in settler environments. Through performance ethnography, arts-based and indigenous methodologies, the study centers their lived experiences and ancestral memories while looking at how emergent Swana traditions and the reclamation of ancestral practices is one of many ways that resistance takes shape as transformation of hegemonic colonial and settler paradigms. So at the center of this research, I hold the Armenian concept or idea, Hok Danil, and I define it as bringing care or bringing spirit. So Hok Danil is central to this research in how it orients relations of care as kinship, as an act of caring for an other, which includes but is not limited to children, elders, community spirit, land, ancestral memory, and one's interrelated self. It foregrounds interdependence as opposed to independence as a possible disruption to the exploitation and institutionalization of systemic forces and coloniality and capitalism within relationships of care. So I bring my research into this, I think, largely or, you know, in relation to my visual art is because what I have, I guess, always imagined my body of work as being really held in ancestral reclamation as part and parcel of any form of futurism that I'm engaging with, whether that's queer futurism or diasporic futurism or Armenian futurism. So they're really, you know, closely connected. I don't really see that that work as separate. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. I can say a few more things, but it'll be mostly feelings. So I'm trying to put a cap on that. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Kemi. And Kemi, if you want to maybe put some of those links you were mentioning in the chat, and I can chat it to the participants.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. Your work is truly incredible, and yeah, I'm thinking, do I know any Armenian sci-fi? And I maybe if some of the participants know it, they can chat it too. I would love to know more about that. And thank you for your interventions in that realm. So to close off, or to end the panel portion of the evening, we have the incredible Herak Bhartanyan. So Herak, I'll send it to you now.
Great, thank you so much. So happy to be here. I felt like this was a great opportunity to pull on some threads since we're talking about this. And I want to mention that I use the term Armo-futurism just because I think we're all sort of staking out what we'd like the term to be. And I think one of the beautiful things about American English is its tendency to shorten things. So I liked Armo-futurism. So just so you know, that's what I'll be using. So I'm going to start by showing, during the introduction, it was mentioned my installation with Sharon Loudon that took place at Signs and Symbols Gallery 2 years ago. I'm just going to be showing that while I do the introduction. Awesome. Can everyone see that? Great. So come along on my journey. So how do we dream about futures when the president past is so contested? I want to point out something I think is important to mention, which is that many of these conversations we're having future in the Armenian, definitely in the Armenian communities I've been part of, harness the imagination and imagine new futures. They're taking place in predominantly women-led and queer-led spaces, not to mention spaces that include Black, Arab, trans, and voices that have not historically been included. They're spaces that embrace those of us who see no refuge in an idealized present or past. I'd like to think of it as a way for some of us to smuggle ourselves into the future, in worlds that contain us, places we build together, so that there is no need to be accommodated. I use the word smuggle because the worlds we inhabit today are not always built for Armenians. Whether it's categories of race, histories of art, or software that continues to underline our names, foods, and cities in red, denoting foreignness, unfamiliarity, exile, or pain, making us question if what we are saying is right. And in the most intimate moments, we can spark absurd questions like, why doesn't my own smartphone recognize my own name? For me, Armo-futurism is not territorial. It's beyond borders. It imagines the world as our homeland, since it's the only thing large enough to contain all of our dreams. It's not to say it can't also contain the rights of self-determination for Indigenous communities, but it does not exclude, it embraces. It doesn't ask for blood quantum, but asks for respect and listening. Now I'd like to discuss some worlds that came before us, but within which fragments of the future, in my opinion, have been smuggled. The Armenian Genocide Memorial might seem an odd place to start, but I'd suggest the monument is one of the great futuristic imaginings of the 20th century. In this memorial, located in Yerevan, its sci-fi-like form suggests a futuristic glory atop the ruins of tragedy. The flame is eternal, suggesting time embedded deep within. Memory plays a role, but it's also about staking a claim to the future that will embrace the tragedy and its legacy. This is also about planting seeds. The monument inspired others around the world, including this one in Montebello, which is a small city in LA County that opened, and this opened in April 1968, only a year after Tizenaga Pert, which is the name of the memorial in Yerevan. It's designed by Herak Bhartanyan. It's the first in the US, and perhaps, as far as I can tell through my research, the first outside Armenia that still remains in one piece. Since the original Armenian genocide memorial, known as Hushartsan, was erected in Istanbul near Taksim Square in 1919 by a still unknown artist, but it was soon dismantled and lost, reminding us that many people don't want to see us in our stories in the future, where others may ask, what happened here? A good reminder that other people's futures are often built atop our own. Montebello's memorial went on to influence others, such as this one in Toronto, the city I grew up, which is the one on your left. And the white pillars turns into pink granite here. And this one was unveiled in 1985. I was at the unveiling, and I remember thinking that the genocide became real that day. I had something to point to where I lived. That thing, what that represents, it'll be here after I'm gone. I remember thinking, it's like a message in the bottle for those who come across it in the future. Across the same country, another more recent memorial in Vancouver, which you see on the right, was unveiled in 2014. And it decided to reinvent the concept of the memorial and choose a genocide survivor whose name's never been revealed as far as I can tell, and enlarge their fingerprint as an indelible mark on the city. While fingerprints can often be associated with crime in the popular imagination, here it's left as proof of existence, the mark of a survivor. Contemporary artists like Melik Ohanyan have contributed to the growing archive and language of memory with his Geneva Memorial, which took over a decade to be unveiled as pro-Turkish and right-wing Swiss factions fought against its placement in the city. Ohanyan's work was included in the Golden Lion winning Armenian Pavilion at the 2015 Venice Biennale. And here you can see the dismantled version on the island of San Lazzaro in Venice. The lampposts and their teardrop lights appear to weep, like mourners who never leave. In the future, what will this resemble? Who's it for? Those are questions we should ask in Armo-Futurism. And here you could see it was finally erected a few years ago in Geneva. And you could see it's a series of lampposts, and each of them have a slightly, this sort of teardrop form. As I already mentioned, the future is contested, and Armenians know this too well, as we're sadly accustomed to having our past being bulldozed to accommodate other people's futures. It's not a coincidence that ISIS, or the Islamic State, the terror regime in Iraq and Syria, bombed the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Deir Zor. Many people may not know they also took over the Armenian Catholic Church in Raqqa, which actually became the headquarters of the organization. And you could see here on the right what it looked like during the time that they made it into their headquarters. In a perfect world, Armo-Futurism not only is about making space for ourselves, but for nurturing what's there, ensuring it continues, helping recover it when it's lost and it reappears. And it's about making room for many and not turning into what we hate. In this case, I can happily report the building is being returned to its original function, even if the local community was forced to flee. The world created on the ashes of disaster might inform Armo-Futurism in its own way. In the case of Yenov Derhagopian, who you see on the top left with Arshil Gorky, because they were friends, who was not only a sculptor, but a widely recognized musician. He built his lost world in his backyard. Let's call it the Mount Ararat of Yonkers, which is a city just north of New York City. In addition to the Holy Mountain, he also created a compact Lake Van, which is out of the frame here. Many of you may remember this because, or at least this idea of recreating this sort of compact world, because in a film like Mount Ararat, or I should say, I'm sorry, like in Atamigoyan's Ararat, here you see an art historian played by Arsina Khanjan confronting the famous film director making a movie about the genocide played by Charles Aznavour. You wouldn't be able to see Mount Ararat from Van, Khanjan's character says. Yes, but I felt it would be important, the director replies. But it's not true, she shoots back. But it is in spirit, he concludes. Our Armo-Futurism understands this difference. In 1968, during the huge wave of protests during the era, artist Onig Kardash, who originally hails, from Zahle, Lebanon, performed a protest at St. Vartan's Cathedral in Manhattan. From 10 a.m. until roughly 1 or 2 p.m., he told me, he stood by the church with his "Unhate a Turk this day, April 24th" sign, while mostly elderly parishioners, as it was a Thursday and most of the younger people were at work, walked by. That night after that performance, he said a who's who of New York's Armenian American intellectual scene came to his house to discuss the event, which certainly made waves. He told me he was inspired by the Black Panthers across the hallway from his studio at 15th Street and 5th Avenue. The building was owned by an Argentinian Armenian, he told me, in one of the markers of Armenian identity, where our lived geographies are mapped by each other, even if they're invisible to others. Radical times demanded radical measures. In this case, the performance left his Armenian identity behind too. Today, Kardash tells me he doesn't really identify as Armenian. True story. Which, like many of the modernist New York Armenian artists of his generation, including Raoul Haig, Ruben Nakian, even Arshil Gorky, was seen as an obstacle to their public artistic futures, even if in private they nurtured other worlds. So this is a question we also have to consider. How can one engage with new public futures and not leave it all behind? That's the question this piece raises for me, and something this futurism must consider. In Garine Torosyan's Girl from Mush from 1993, there's another imagining. Torosyan uses collage in a way that captures the disconnect and the insertion of an experience in diaspora. As images sit inside and atop other images, some well-known, others more personal or esoteric, all in the same space. An imaginary phone call reaches beyond the present into something that may or may not exist. In the string of images, we see a pattern and consider the connections, but the narrative can elude us, like the phone call that evokes familiarity for those of us who remember these calls. When the distance is simultaneously far and near, strange and intimate, and how technology transmits those feelings without ever bridging them fully. I remember seeing the film for the first time in Torosyan's home when it was finished, before it was finished, I apologize. And remember it was another instance for me of thinking, this is my future. In 2015, Palestinian artist Benji Boyadjian, who is an East Jerusalem resident, drew this map of the West Bank barrier wall. Titled Phantasmagoria of Drones, it is a rendering of Bethlehem's complex landscape without the aid of drones or most technological tools. Google's map card doesn't cross the Israeli checkpoints, and a cloud obstructed the view on Binge, he told me. And Palestinians can't fly drones like this, not to mention that standing on rooftops by the wall is prohibited, and those with views have to cover their windows at all times unless they want to visit by Israeli authorities. This black and white drawing was commissioned by 2 anthropologists in the Bethlehem area. They were doing field work for an exhibition called Shared Sacred Spaces and were interested in Rachel's tomb, which you can see just encircled by a wall on the bottom leftish corner. The artist calls the drawing a psychogeographic performance to unfold the vision of an imaginary drone. This is not a view any Palestinian can have under the occupation. It is something cobbled together from a great deal of observation, he told me. I had so many apprehensions because I was skeptical about how to represent the wall without objectifying it. So you can see here is his subjective rendering based on the impact of the wall on the lives of Palestinians and by his careful observation throughout the area. This is a world he created, imagining a future that could be again, one that doesn't have to imagine a world not dominated by a wall, inshallah, one day. Then there are people who don't easily fit into these Armenian narratives at all. Can we accommodate them too? I'm thinking of Skander Boisian, Here you see his night flight of dread and delight. He was an Ethiopian Armenian artist who was engaged in Pan-African philosophy in Paris during the 1960s and was fully engaged with the Negritude movement at the time. Many recently have seen him as maybe an early proponent of what later became called Afrofuturism. Can our newly formed Armofuturism welcome him, his work, his dreams and ambitions? If not, why not? An art professor at the historically Black college, Howard University, for 29 years, his contact with Armenian cultural communities was limited, even as he played the role of a patriarch for the Ethiopian American cultural community. And do we need to create an Armofuturism that could celebrate him too? Can he be a bridge to new worlds? In the past, we often find the future. So in this fluid imagining that transverses borders, genres, and time, I want to suggest a final image, one that might help us imagine the future in a new way. Arthur Pinadjian was a comic book artist. His most endearing creation is Madame Fatale in the 1940s. Madame Fatale was the first cross-dressing superhero. The alter ego of a handsome, intelligent, and pipe-smoking man named Richard Stanton, who made a fortune in Wall Street in the 1920s, and was also a world-famous actor on the stage, theater, radio, and film actor, according to the bio in the comic book. His fame brings unwanted attention and his daughter is kidnapped. Stanton attempts to find his daughter and his wife eventually dies of a broken heart. At a time when Armenian newspapers around the world were full of notices asking for information about lost relatives, it's hard not to imagine that this storyline may not have emerged from a more personal place. So Stanton, the debonair millionaire, dresses as an old woman named Madame Fatale to fight crime, often benefiting from the way people underestimate the elderly, particularly older women. Using his cane, apparently he's an expert cane fighter, he tries to find his daughter, which he later discovers a crime kingpin passed along to other criminals. There's a lot to read into here. The thing is, we call Stanton a superhero, but he's not endowed with any superpowers. But let's consider another reading, a queerer reading of this character. Richard Stanton disguises himself as a senior citizen. He uses the cloak of invisibility because we know, particularly then, older women are often overlooked, or were often, not that it's much better today. To uncover criminals and fight for justice, this was his disguise. Maybe we should be imagining Armofuturism just like Pinadjian imagined Madame Fatale, reinvented, of course. Just like comic book artist James Robinson did in 2015 when in issue 4 of The Shade, when he transformed the elderly Madame Fatale into a sexy young librarian. To hell with the original, right? What would it look like if we took this on, imagining a figure like this, a figure that transgresses boundaries and borders like we do as Armenians, one that pushes the boundaries of social mores and conventions, and hide behind the expectations that suggest our culture is dying, like they said about Native Americans and others who don't fit dominant narratives. What if we imagined Armofuturism as something malleable and changing, just like this unsuperhero's superhero? The beauty of Madame Fatale is that it is the expectations of others she plays with, using their blindness against them. In the future, may we live around 1 million Madame Fatales that morph and change and blossom. I'm going to end with this one last image that I took last fall during the Artsakh protests here in New York. This event took place at the George Washington Bridge that connects New York and New Jersey states. And the sign on the top, as you see, reminds us what this is about. Because in the future, Armenians do exist, and we better start imagining it. I also just want to say, because I haven't been feeling well, I forgot to mention that I am speaking from Brooklyn, and which of course is the homeland of the Lenape people, as well as the Nyack and the Canarsie nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Herak. I'm obsessed with Madame Fatale now, so I know what I'm going to be doing after this is going down a wormhole. Thank you so much for telling us about that and for the amazing artwork that you shared. So now we will move to the questions. And please chat your questions to one of the hosts, and we will share them with everybody. And we can plan on, how about going until, let me just check the time. We'll plan on going until about 7:30. So we have a bit of time for questions. So I hope you have some to share. In the meantime, while you are thinking about how to respond to these amazing panelists, one thing that somebody sent me in a chat, Talin Boskuni told me that her sister, let me find it, her sister Tamar has written an Armenian sci-fi speculative fiction novel that is currently being pitched. So there is some Armenian sci-fi out there. So that's very, very exciting. So definitely keep your eye out for that.
So can I also mention something? I think also there is, I believe, some Soviet Armenian sci-fi from the era. So there's also historically, there's also a little cache of literature in that as well.
Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah, of course. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I also, before we get to the questions, I also did want to acknowledge Herak. If it should be Armo Futurism, I'm down. Although Herak did also, like, I think the end that Turian is another sort of possibility. So the name is up for grabs, but I think we have two very strong contenders here. Okay, so we'll start. I have one question here for Kemi. How do you begin a journey of ancestral connection when you feel the thread between you and your ancestors may be gone? So this is a two-part question. So let me chat it to you, Kemi, so that you can look at it. And then, yeah, sorry, let me find you here.
Tough one. Do you want to give me the second part, or should I just?
Yeah.
Okay. Wow, this is two very unrelated questions, but I like it. Yeah. So I've definitely, I think, been through times in my life where I thought that the thread between my ancestors and I is gone. Specifically, I think the context is kind of important. It was around me looking for Armenian rituals and spiritual practices that predate Christianity, and not having any resources for that at all, other than like little word of mouth things and stuff that I heard here and there. And that was a really big moment for me, of sort of, yeah, there was a mourning there. And then I had a friend who's an Indigenous scholar, and mother and artist, who told me, what if I just write or live as if it is inside me, and that I just know it and I make it up. And that was like a really big aha moment for me, because it allowed me to give myself the permission to to just assume that it is even if my ancestors didn't leave behind journals and books, and they didn't pass them down directly to me, etc. That doesn't mean that it's I don't have access to it. And that I think that was a big moment for me, where I was like, oh, I'm allowed to to speculate and to create and to improvise, right? To create my own and to improvise. And that is still a valid and important connection to have, I think. And then in terms of combating Armenianness and Armeno-Futurism as being written off as Western, I don't like, so I'll say that if somebody were to tell me that Armeno-Futurism is Western, I would tell them like, what makes the future Western? I think it's time as a construct, I guess, a colonial construct. So maybe there is that argument there, but yeah, I don't like, that's not gonna, I wouldn't any type of futurity and futurism, there are, you know, people have been writing about the future and predicting the future for millennia. Like, I don't really, I wouldn't buy that. In terms of queerness being Western, you know, yeah. Do I want to get into that right now? Maybe, sure. No, it was a political argument. I think, like, I would just say no, honestly. I don't, and also the thing is, like, for me, you know, that question is like really, it's so politicized, right? Because, and people also say feminism is a Western construct, and like they're trying to, you know, you take our women away from our families and blah blah blah. Like, I don't really like even engage with that anymore, to be honest. And not because I don't have to, but because I've just decided not to conserve my own energy and capacity, which is very limited.
It reminds me, I think, Mashinka, maybe in your comments you had mentioned something about legibility, and I think that's one issue that we often have. You know, the frameworks that we have that make us legible, especially in this sort of, you know, imperial context, are often things that force us to speak in these frames, and, you know, force us to be Western or something like that, just so we're visible, just so we're legible. And so, yeah, I totally understand Kemi not wanting to engage, but it is also this, unfortunately, like this thing that we have to sort of contend with, you know, like, what are the languages we have to speak in order to be legible? And so, yeah, that
and also, like, I grew up in the West, so yeah, my ideas and my way of seeing the world are going to be somewhat informed, right? I can't deny that. That's sort of the push and pull of, like, being a diasporic queer Armenian person. Like, it's gonna happen. You have to be aware of that and critique it and unpack it, and, you know, and also live with it.
Mashinka or Herak, do you have anything to say? Or we can move on to the next question.
I mean, I suppose I would say that, of course, I agree with Kemi completely, basically. And I think, of course, there's also tremendous value in developing regionally and culturally situated and specific forms of knowledge and understanding. And for example, Bukian, who I mentioned in my talk, has a great article on the Queering Yerevan Collective and Darori Nakel, which is the word that they use to supplant queerness, which means to make strange in Armenian. But at the same, and there's, again, enormous value in that. But at the same time, if one of our collective aims is to build coalition and solidarity, which is not mutually exclusive with having regionally specific terms, there also needs to be some sort of basis for shared dialogue and collective understanding. You can't build solidarity if you can't come to a place of sharing terminology or sharing certain frameworks of understanding, I think.
And I'll just add, I usually try not to engage in those kind of questions, because I usually, when you drill down, you realize that it's very specific to this one issue, and those same people tend to be very pro-Western in other weird ways. So, you know, I think it's just a way of trying to other, and I just, you know, I refuse to sort of engage in that kind of, you know, marginalization.
Wonderful. So we have another wonderful question. I'll read it out loud. For all participants, what does ARMO, this is really good because we had mentioned sort of the conversations that ARMO Futurism is engaged with you know, like Afro and Arab futurism. So for all participants, what does ARMO Futurism look like in coordination with other futurist movements, e.g. Afro and Arab futurism, especially when, quote, there are Black people in the future is a clear precedent for, quote, there are Armenians in the future, and in light of current movements of solidarity regarding Sheikh Jarrah and the Israeli occupation, which is definitely sort of a specter hanging over us right now, given what is going on. So this is a very timely and important question. And so Herak, Kemi, or Mashinka, any takeaways? Okay,
I can start if that's all right. Well, first of all, I just want to mention that Arab futurism does incorporate Armenians and many Armenian communities. So, you know, first of all, it's not so alien. And I mean, whether Afrofuturism does, I mean, I did bring up Boisian, who's actually a great example of, I think there are communities and individuals part of this story that have just been either marginalized or lost, which I think is something we've noticed in the last few decades, particularly when it comes to Armenian women's contributions to our modern history and contemporary. So I think we're going to be excavating those and finding more of those connections than we probably know. Like in the case of Onik Kardash, mentioning that he says the Black Panthers across the hall, it's actually the Student Nonviolence, well, what's the name of the group? The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had their offices across from the studio. And, you know, you know, like these sort of connections, we're going to start mapping and finding those. You know, and I think part of it is we just don't have the research yet. We have it, you know, people have not been like Onik Kardash. I was the first person to interview him about this, you know, like in this kind of extensive way. This is the first time people have seen this photograph of Yenov Der Hagopians, you know, in a public forum. I mean, the man had that sculpture up for decades, do you know? And so the research is just being done. So I think we're going to start coordinating. And I mean, in the case of Palestinian solidarity, there's actually a very long history of Armenian and Palestinian solidarity, including through, whether it's through the various wars. I mean, something as simple as Malcolm, I don't know if people know this, but in the case of Martin Luther King Jr., his actually introduction to Palestinian issues was through an Armenian doctor, Palestinian doctor. Do you know, who actually told him about it and introduced him. So these histories are there. We just haven't found a way to graph them and understand how they connect.
And I want to give Mashinka and Kemi an opportunity to respond if they would like, but on that note, this doesn't directly relate to the question in terms of Afrofuturism, but one thing that made me think about in a number of my interviews, it was the civil rights movement that gave Armenians the language, the Armenian Americans the language to visualize their own liberation and their own sort of relationship to justice. And so the relationship is absolutely there. Yeah, that was just something that came to my mind. Yeah.
Can I bring up two more little quick points? One thing, for instance, in the connection, like Aurora Martiganyan's biography that was written, and this is, I think, was it Shushan that wrote this in a paper mentioning the fact that it's actually written like a slave narrative. So the way that it has like a little sort of introduction, it's actually written equivalent to African-American manumission narratives. That's one. The other thing is the term genocide, often people forget that a lot of that percolated in New York and in America, the use of the term after the Holocaust, and because of the connection with Jewish American communities and other communities that were also understanding it. And that was one of the roots that it sort of entered the Armenian dialogue. Do you know? So those connections are all there. Thank you.
Mashinka, Mashinka or Kemi, did you?
Actually, I'd love to follow up on that. Yeah, to echo Herak's comments, there is a very long history of joint struggle, joint Armenian-Palestinian struggle. Looking to Monte Melkonian and his work with the PLO, looking to the collective organizing that's being done by groups like the Armenian Action Network, who came up in your remarks, Sylvia, and the work that Sophia Arman is doing. So I think that there's obviously a great deal of resonance in the way that our communities have been denuded of a future and denuded of the possibility of imagining a future as a viable prospect. And my hope is that through recent organizing, like through AAN, those conversations will continue to emerge and more coalitional links will be made. And to address the earlier portion of the question, I think that's without denying for a second that as I said in my talk, Armenian futurism, of course, owes debts of gratitude to indigenous futurism and Afrofuturism and Arab futurism. But I think that there is a tendency to imagine lines of influence existing unidirectionally, to imagine Armenian culture making as the recipient of influence, and very rarely to imagine Armenian cultural practices as those practices that exert influence on others. And, you know, as Herak pointed out, there are artists living in, artists of Armenian descent living in Lebanon, like Herak Bhartanyan, for example, who one might characterize as an whose practice one might characterize as Armeno-futurist, that has emerged in dialogue with Arab futurism that could very easily also be positioned as an agent of influence on Arab futurism. And so I think I would be careful about the directionality that's implied in the way that we think about these questions.
And another sort of place where my mind goes is, we're also talking about groups that have never had sort of narrative authority. I think about Edward Said's Permission to Narrate, and how these sorts of claimings, or these claimings of these various sites of becoming are another way of creating some agent and narrative authority in a world that has denied them that. So I think that's another sort of interesting sort of overlap that we have with these other futurisms. I wanted to very quickly note, if it's okay, share the person's name, Levon Kavakian, who I think was mentioned earlier, mentions that in the heavily Arab Detroit area, together with 2 Arab writers, I've been facilitating HBB futurism workshops on imagining futures that hold from across ethnicities, which fills my heart with such, such joy, because these dialogues are happening everywhere. There's something in the air right now. And so Levon, thank you so much for your work. Let me see, there are a number of questions. Let me get to the next one. Okay.
Before you ask the next question, I just want to say, I say Madame Fatal, but honestly, I think it's the Lebanese influence in me. It probably is more generic, Madame Fatal, but I just think Madame Fatal sounds a lot better.
Okay, here's the next question. Thanks to all of you for a stunning panel. I learned so much from each of you. I'd love anyone's thoughts on this. Some have started to think about the relationship between Armenians and indigeneity. Oh, this is wonderful, yeah. How do you all think of that relationship? Are you comfortable considering Armenians as indigenous somehow, somewhere? If so, how and where? If not, why and how would you hold back from that connection? And actually, I've been thinking about this question as well, and I believe it was Mashinka and Herak, or maybe it was somebody else. I know Herak were at least one of them, who through their critical argument. Tamar, thank you. Sorry, it was Tamar. Had us read as a group Tuck and Yang's Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. So I know this is something that many Armenian scholars have been thinking about. So I would love to hear the panelists' remarks on this.
Do you want to start, Mashinka? You've been writing a lot about this.
I have been writing a lot about this, but actually Kami's work is also very much in dialogue with these themes, I think, in terms of practices of ancestral reclamation. And so I think that they would have, Kami, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm putting you on the spot.
I have a lot of conflicting thoughts around it. Where I stand currently on it is that, I, because of like where I'm situated and because of where I'm situated, I do, I don't use capital I Indigenous when I say Indigenous Armenians because of my positionality as a settler here, you know what I mean? Or not a settler, but I'm definitely an uninvited guest here. So like for me, so that's one distinction that I try to make, right? So that I can honor place. In terms of indigeneity in that region, I think becomes complicated because, and this might not be a popular thing to say, and so I might be like shooting myself in the foot here, but on one hand, yes, I refer to the lands that my ancestors were from as indigenous, my ancestors were indigenous to that land. But I do think that in places where so much movement has occurred and different people have identified as indigenous to different lands, it becomes really complicated. Even indigeneity here is complicated in a lot of ways, right? Because of, again, movement and migration. And so, where I stand on it now, I would say is, and it might not answer the question, but I will say that I do look to a lot of capital I Indigenous scholars, and in the ways that they write about land and stewardship and caring for land. And I do also look to the work of Swana Ancestral Hub. They do a lot of work around ancestry and Indigenous plant ancestral practices. And what I really like about their work, particularly Layla, is that she's constantly reminding me that to be in solidarity with the land and what that means. And also, that the land doesn't know, it doesn't know, right? Like, and we make so many assumptions about, I think about that. And I think about that a lot because I own land here, right? I own my home, and I think a lot about what that actually means as like a diasporic Armenian survivor of genocide, like, etc. And so I just feel like I have a lot of complicated feelings about it, and it's not helpful. It's complex, so I'll stop.
I thought it was very helpful.
It was.
It was very helpful to me.
Yes.
May I?
Please.
Kemi, I share your hesitation about invoking indigeneity as an uninvited guest on North American Indigenous land. I certainly don't feel that I can identify as Indigenous, but I absolutely and strongly hold the conviction that there is a tremendous value in affirming Armenian indigeneity in West Asia, not as an ethno-territorial claim, not as a claim that precludes cohabitation or coexistence, but as a claim that thinks honestly and carefully about the Indigenous relationship to land in those regions and the Indigenous relationship to life and life worlds that our ancestors and their ancestors held, from which they were severed through forced displacement and dispossession and dispersal. And so as a practice of historical truth-telling, or what, Tamar Sherinian argued for in her recent article on the violence of dispassionate objectivity, as a practice of being accountable to historical truth, I think that there is a real value in that affirmation.
Yeah, I agree.
But Herak, I know you were the one who led the conversation on Armenian indigeneity.
Well, I have two main points to make, because I've obviously been thinking about this for quite a while. I think the connection that it seems most fruitful for me in terms of conversation with many Indigenous communities is that as Armenians, I find it very informative, and I feel like there's a lot of connections to be made over the notions of post-genocide diasporas, which I think people forget that most Indigenous communities in North America are diasporas. They don't actually live on their traditional homelands. So I think in that way, there's a lot of similarities. And that's I think you find a lot of really useful understanding as a result of it. So I found a lot of usefulness in connecting and understanding these sort of how post-genocide diasporas function. The second is, I actually think our notion of Indigenous is sometimes tied a little bit too much to capitalism and land, because Indigenous groups migrate. For instance, the Dene people in Northern Canada became the Navajo people only 700 years ago when they migrated across the continent. But we don't say the Navajo aren't Indigenous, right? And so I do think we also have a very traditional idea that ties it. And I think it's part of the logic of this sort of capitalist culture where everything has to be clearly delineated, right? And it has to be clearly divided. I mean, I'll fight you tooth and bone to saying Artsakh is absolutely the Armenians that are Indigenous, you know what I mean? Without a question. But at the same time, in the case of Armenians in Iran, are they Indigenous? Well, when you're invited onto a land and sort of given space, that actually kind of fits into the definition in a way. Like one could migrate a community and still be Indigenous, if there is a connection. So I think we're actually still at an early stage of understanding the complexity of the issue. You know, but at the same time, I think this idea of, I also think it's possible to both be to have many communities indigenous to the same place, you know, and that not being a conflict, and one doesn't have to supersede the other. And that's something we're going to have to learn if we're going to, I mean, Arma Futurism, like that's kind of, I think, is the work in a way.
Yeah, I know. I've been thinking about this so much, again, thanks to Herak Bhartanyan and of course Kemi's work and a number of the other scholars that you've mentioned. And one thing that I think about is if we utilize indigeneity as a frame, you know, I wonder how that coexists or conversates, I guess, with diaspora, like in terms of how we sort of identify as a group. Because, you know, indigeneity has a spatial specificity to it that sort of, you know, runs counter, I think, to what diaspora depends on, which is sort of this imagined or this sort of mythical place that we all, you know, can lay claim to. And so, I wonder what it would be to think about those two things sort of simultaneously, or if, you know, if one sort of does without the other. But anyway, that's sort of where my mind goes when I think about this question. How about we take one more? There are amazing questions here, and that I will share with the panelists. But thank you as we go to this last question, I want to thank all the participants who have joined us today. I hope this conversation has sparked something in you and something that you will take with you and continue these dialogues elsewhere. So we will go now to our last question. And I am completely inept with Zoom, even after a year plus of pandemic Zooming. So here we go. This question is for anyone. Traditionally, Armenian diasporans have concentrated in physical communities and created large Armenian populations, e.g. Glendale, Toronto. Looking to the future, how do you see our community fully harnessing the potential of virtual communities? As they're thinking through this, I will say, as an Armenian who grew up in the bubbling Armenian community of Tulsa, Oklahoma, I often wonder what it would have been like for me to have access to a virtual world. So yeah, so maybe, so for any of you small towners out there, or those of you who grew up in small Armenian communities, I think having this virtual space is huge.
I'm still trying to get over seeing Toronto mentioned as a large Armenian community.
Excuse me.
sorry, I grew up there. I can say it. I
didn't know that.
I grew up in Glendale, and I have only met recently, like, you know, 3 dozen other queer Armenians who grew up in Glendale at the same time that I did, who I had whose existence I could have never fathomed or imagined or conjured up prior to them direct messaging me on Instagram. And so, you know, irrespective of how small or large the town or city may be, yeah, there's a tremendous value to you know, to digital diaspora, as a lot of folks have called it.
I mean, that's how Hyphen started, right? Hyphen was like, you know, Sevan making this like weird zine, a queer Armenian, you know, and then people were like, you know, they built community around it, and they couldn't even believe that there were other queer Armenians in the world, let alone in like the LA area. And that's how, you know, that's how that whole collective and magazine started. So we're out here.
Some of the people that I still connect with is from the early blogging days of like the Armenian blogosphere, right? You know, people that were like writing like in 2004 and 5 and are still engaged. So, I mean, a lot of my community, my Armenian community comes from online, even more. And usually the people who are offline, they come through online, kind of like Mashinka said, and then you're like, oh, right, we went to school together, or we know each other, or our brothers, or whatever, you know, one of these things. So, I mean, I don't know an offline community necessarily. Like most of my communities are online now, it seems, especially in terms of Armenians.
For sure. Yeah, I live in a really rural town, and it's like always there, you know, it's like, I don't know, there's maybe 2 other Armenian families here. But that's even a stretch to say, you know. But I will say though, is fully harnessing the potential of virtual communities is something that I've been thinking about a lot for many, many years, and have applied to many grants to harness the power of the virtual to bring Armenians together in many iterations of projects. But in a time like this, I cannot say how badly I want to physically be around other Armenians. Like I can't, it's just, it has been heightened in a major, major way in the last year, especially since the war started in the fall, where I just would like find myself feeling like having outer body experiences where I'd be around folks, and I just really just wanted to be around other Armenians. Like, I think, and then that makes a lot of sense, right? Because like when you're going through all of that, like you really just want to be with your people. But I will say one really nice thing is when you run into people in small ass towns, when you did not expect to meet an Armenian. Years ago, I was driving through some random small town in Utah, just totally random. And I'm sitting at this little diner, and it was a little scary. I was like, this is where scary stuff happens, you know? And and I was talking in Armenian with my kiddo, and the waitress, who was this like 70-plus-year-old lady who looked like a little cowgirl, she was really cute. She was like, what language are you speaking? And I was just like so hot and so annoyed and just so on defense. Like I was just like, everyone's gonna be on defense. And I was like, Armenian, I'm Armenian. It's what the curly hair is about. Let's move on, you know? And she was like, my father was Armenian. And she starts crying and tells me about how like her father, like about her like ancestors who came to America because one of the ancestors married some I don't know, like what do you call it? Oh my goodness, I'm losing my like thing, like what, the missionaries. Mm-hmm. And that's how they came. And she's telling me this whole story, and she's like bawling her eyes out. And it was like this amazing moment of like, fuck virtual. Like I get a message from someone, and like maybe for 5 minutes I'm like, that was cute, you know? But when you meet them in person, and like, you know, there's just something really powerful about that. So I'm like, I'm gonna be the unpopular person who says I'm like just over virtual communities. I just want to be around the people, like sharing actual such, not pictures of the bottom of people's such cups that are sent to me through WhatsApp every day.
I am with you. I'm with you 100%. And without diminishing the value of virtual community, I want to say that a lot of the practices that make us diasporic communities, that the diverse and disparate and heterogeneous practices, they are practices that are not possible virtually. And we experience a loss, a real and palpable loss when we are dispersed spatially. And as someone who's been doing a lot of housing justice and tenants' rights activist work, I want to say that I don't want to imagine a future where Glendale's diasporic community, for example, where I grew up and where I currently live, has dispersed and become completely fragmented, because that would mean that we as a community had experienced another wave of tremendous economic injustice and displacement through economic violence, not unlike the ways we have experienced historically for several generations.
Well, with that, I think it's 7:45 in Chicago, and I could keep you all for another, multiple hours, but out of respect for the time of our amazing panelists, Mashinka, Kemi, and Herak, I'm just so incredibly, this has been just a totally fulfilling event, and I cannot thank all of you enough. Thank you to Holly and to Hripsime and to Nelt at the University of Chicago for making this possible. And anyway, my bachigner to all of you in the audience. And I hope we can continue these conversations in person and online. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming.